Hi everyone, this is Ken Master Isaac Steincamp from the Chess Summit Network, and for today's video I wanted to share some exercises I did on my own. If you rated about 2,000, it's an interesting exercise to kind of do this sort of reflection. But I took every single draw that I had in my database where I was rated about 1,800 or 18 to 1,900 or lower. So for me that's like 2014 and earlier, and really look to see if all the draws that I had were actually draws, and if one side was winning, I tried to grind it out. Either against myself or trying to compare my lines to an engine's, just to see how my assessment of the position was back then, but also to see if I've improved now, if I can recognize that maybe the position's not so simple. And this first position I think would be a great opportunity. This was in 2013. I had just broken 1900. I was playing in the Eastern Open, and it was a night game, and both my opponent and I, we had just both come off of decent results. I think I just won my game, and my opponent had just drawn his, and we were just looking for a really easy game, hopefully a draw, and move on to the next morning. And so here I recaptured a trade on e2. I offered my opponent a draw, and he looked at the position for a minute and immediately accepted. And his thought was, and mine was too, I guess fair to say, was that okay, after bishop takes f3, queen takes f3, queen takes f3, g takes f3, white has created a concession on the king side, but it's not exactly easy for black to do anything. And even if he tries to rook lift or open up the f file with f5, okay, I'll let him trade on e4 and I'll undouble my pawns. And should he decide that he wants to double up on my c pawn, I'll have sufficient protectors. But I already think that you guys can see that there was a flaw in my thinking here. So even in this position, tactically maybe I can hold. After rook to a4, I'll just play rook to a2. If he plays rook back to c4, I'll go forth. But I think you guys can appreciate the fact that after a position somewhat like this, this isn't even the position with the best play. It already looks like white is looking very desperate. Perhaps white, when he tries to bring in the king to f1. Okay, black plays a move of can consider playing moves like f5 to open up the fourth rank, and things get interesting. So already, we're not even looking at the best moves, and it already appears that black has gotten some sort of an edge here. So relatively quick assessment of the position should show that perhaps maybe black shouldn't have taken this draw so quickly. And so we go back to this position, and I if I recall correctly, I believe I only really considered bishop takes f3 because I thought my opponent also, just like me, wanted a draw. So okay, we'll start with this position, but we'll come back to the original position in a second. If you look at what white's play is, white doesn't really have any dynamic play, and it's very clear he's statically worse, right? He's got the worst pawn structure on the f-file, he's got a backwards pawn here, and he has an isolated pawn on the a-file. So already I think that black has some initiative to work with. Me on the other hand, I could say maybe I could play against this b-pawn, but if he really wanted to, he could just play b6 right now. And even if with a move like c4, it's still a backwards pawn, and he'll never get to play c5. So I think it's already kind of clear that black is slightly better. Maybe not winning, but slightly better. And in this position, even here, white has sufficient forces to defend everything. But again, we already have to start worrying about tactical ideas like b5. And so, okay, we go back, and if okay, let's say white tries to play more tactically sound and says, okay, well, I bought myself a tempo to bring in my king. Well, black will still bring in his rooks. Okay, well, there's no b6, b5, b4 idea because of the e3 pawn covering b4 as well. But again, he's pushing, and I'd like to be able to say that a win here is simple, but perhaps my opponent even saw this position and was like, okay, well, okay, maybe I'm better, but I already I have the result that I want in my hand, and I don't really have to work that hard for it, and this I can be here for a couple hours just to find that there's nothing in this position, and perhaps this is true. But both my opponent and I made a very critical mistake from the opening position. So if we go back, both my opponent and I made the mistake that we assumed that bishop takes f3 would be the best move. And I think that this was a really big mistake. Black actually doesn't have to take bishop takes f3. The knight is pinned. It's not going to go anywhere. He should play bishop takes f3 at some point, either after h3 or maybe after white moves the queen. But there's no reason why black actually has to play this move, bishop takes f3. And I think that this was like the first mistake for both of us, just from a pure calculation standpoint. Both my opponent and I we were rated about 1900 at the time, and even though we were told to look at forcing moves, we only really looked at the forcing moves with no rhyme or reason. Black has no incentive to have to take immediately. He'd rather make white have to create a concession, even if that concession is just as simple as, okay, well, black plays this move rook to e to c8 and white gets out of the pen. Well, okay, already not only are we winning this pawn, well, we can argue that we've already won ourselves a tempo. So the position's not that simple. And so, okay, rook to e to c8 is a good move, b6 is a good move, but let's say for the sake of argument, rook to e to c8 is the way to go. If white plays c4, again, we lose the pawn. Bishop takes, queen takes, pawn takes, or okay, you could argue that white could play pawn takes, but I don't think that this would be such a comfortable position after queen to f4, controlling all these critical dark squares, and perhaps planning like an f5, and then bring the rook to f8, f6, f6 and g6, and try to checkmate white. I wouldn't play g takes f3. And after queen takes f3, it only makes sense to have traded the bishop for the knight if we're also going to ruin the pawn structure. And okay, black gets his pawn. So okay, well, c4 isn't possible. White, better act quickly with a move like rook on f to c1. Okay, we can still take the knight in this position, but just like the last position, we want white to make some sort of a concession. This is a really important moment. So instead of putting the rook on c4, because now the queen's occupying c4, we can just put the rook on c5. Okay, white will play rook to c2, rook to c8, rook to c1. Okay, what's different about this position than the starting line that we looked at is, okay, well, black hasn't exactly committed himself to having to play bishop takes f3 yet. And I think that's a very important distinction. Because, okay, at some point, maybe black will take on f3, but you'll only take one convenient for him. Already, even though it's not so clear how to improve the position, I think that, white can just, make, white has to make waiting moves, while black can just make natural moves to kind of improve the position. Already we can start thinking about a move like b6, as long as queen to a6 doesn't work tactically, but I think here already, c3 pawn's lost, and I don't think that this trade will, mount up for anything special for white. Okay, well, we could take on c3, or we could have gone back in this position, and after queen takes a7, we can just start picking up pawns. And white's positions is in shambles. This position was better for black than the other line. So, okay, well, this is definitely thought. So b6 would be an interesting way to improve the position, and white's already kind of running low on moves. Perhaps maybe white would want to consider a move like c4, but the problem with a move like c4 is, again, we have like this idea of b5 at the right moment. Bishop takes f3, queen takes f3, queen takes f3. So if we go here, again, white has had to use a tempo and has conceded a weakness, and he's going to lose the game now. So c4, as nice as a move that would look, it's really not a feasible solution for black to black to worry about at this point. And if you're white, okay, well, maybe it's time to recognize that the pressure on this pin is too much. Even though it's not that much, okay, the h3 pawn is a little bit weaker, and it's still up to black to try to come up with a solution to this position. But there's really no rush. And if you think about how white's going to improve the position, he might be able to improve through pushes like f4, h4 at some point, maybe to bring in room for his king or rook. So let's go ahead and just play g5 to hold everything. He's not going to play h4 anytime soon. He's not going to play f4, and these rooks can't move. There's no threats on the b file that white can actually use. And it's not like white's king can cross over very easily. And the moment he gets to g3, we can just start thinking about playing moves like h5. And we don't even have to play g5 immediately. We're not really that worried about a move like h4. But I'd like to think like an interesting idea here would be to play like rook to c7 and then bring the king over to c8 and then to e6 and start bringing him into the queen side. And obviously, this would need to be precise, but, we're just using the idea that if f4 we don't have to take, we can just play a move like f6. And undoubling the pawns for white, it's not quite clear if that's strong. In fact, after f4, we can already start looking at moves like rook to c4. And so, okay, we can play a move like king to f8. If white tries to get just make, standard improving moves, it's not quite clear what this king is doing besides activating the rook. And once rook to g1 is played, we'll play g6. So we'll just keep on bringing the king over. Whoops, it's not black's move. But I think you guys are starting to see the idea. And if, white plays h4 to play h5, well, okay, we're not going to take this pawn. We're just going to play g5. These aren't the best moves for white. I'm just making moves so that way I can kind of make a point here. And already, again, White hasn't really achieved much. He's still very passive. And, he can go, back and forth. He might as well just make waiting moves at this point. A smart move, I guess, would be to play a4 here. But then already this a1 rook is also tied down to the pawn, so after a4 we can play a move like rook to c4. So this would be kind of interesting. But okay, let's say White continues to toggle the rook, and it's not quite clear if this is sufficient, and it's hard to imagine all this from the starting position. But it's clear that Black's king has been able to make more progress than White's, and so this is already an interesting line, I think, to look at. So if White does nothing, like already, it's very hard to kind of figure out what a reasonable game plan would be. And okay, if he doesn't do much, then if he doesn't do much, maybe he gets rolled over. But if you look at around the board, what else is there really to do? One of the reasons why I was looking at g5 was I thought that maybe this king march to a6 and over was a little bit long-winded, and it wasn't quite clear what I was achieving. In trying to create a second weakness. But here maybe I can play king g7, king g6, king h5, king h4, and pick up this h3 pawn. I would have to be careful about some checkmating ideas, if maybe this rook can get over to h1 and g2 can be covered. But okay, if we were to just maybe go through some sample lines here. Okay, there's really no threats. If we really wanted to be precise, maybe we play rook to c4 here, so that way c4 can't be played, because obviously in this position, we have the idea of b5, but honestly, I don't really think I'm worried about this c4 idea, because once one of these three move away, we'll just play b5 and take on c4. Or play a6, which would also be fairly strong, I imagine. So, we just play king h5. If he plays rook to h1, he's already kind of conceding something. Maybe we can start just playing a6. And if he tries to use a tempo to go back, we just play b5, and we've already made progress. And so what I'm trying to say here is not necessarily that Black should have won this game. I feel like that's a very harsh thing to say, to a 1900 rated player back in this position, is that Black is winning. But I think Black has something to play for. And so this kind of brings us to our first endgame evaluation mistake, which was that both players assumed that bishop takes f3 up front would be enough, and even though, okay, Black is slightly better, once we reach those lines where Black just puts a rook on c4 and kind of has to fight against his fortress, he looked at this and assumed that it would be a draw, just like me. But that was the first mistake for both players, and I think that that's very telling. Just because it's a forcing move doesn't mean it's the only move that's going to be played. In fact, not every time a forcing move can happen, it's a good move. So I thought that this was a fairly instructive position, because we just took an idea that, okay, we could wait and then slowly build up the position, and kind of show White that, okay, at some point you're going to have to take on f3. And so when we do, we reach a position where maybe we can expand on the king side, or maybe we weave around to the queen side. But I think that it's fair to say that this position is very rich. For Black, perhaps even in a position like this, an interesting idea could be to play rook to c4 with the idea of playing f5 and rook to f4. And, okay, if White plays king to e2, I'm not so convinced that I would have gone for this with the tripled pawns. I mean, this is really weak, and we don't even have to move the c4 rook. What we can do is we can play a move like rook to f8, and if he tries to attack our rook, we just protect it with the pawn. And as you can see, he's not making progress. a4 is obviously met with rook takes a4, and he's losing his entire kingside front. This might be an actually a more effective way to kind of go through. And so, I didn't do any special engine analysis for this video. This was just kind of like my recollection of what I was thinking back then, and how I would approach these positions now. But I think you all get the point that Black has something to play for. So in our next position, it's from a local tournament. And, if we, not PGN, but FEN, if we look at this position, this is a position that I was either low 1800 or high 1700 at a local tournament. And I was playing this kid who had just jumped from 1400 the previous month to 1700. So, here I played king to g2. Obviously, the h5 pawn is lost no matter what. But the idea being that if knight takes h5, I play rook to h1, and then I take on h6 after he moves the knight because of the pin. But I offered a draw after king to g2 because honestly, I was starting to think that things were slipping. My time management had been poor, and I had blown a huge space advantage, and instead it turned into what was at first a nice space advantage, and then after some mishandling, it quickly became hyperextension. As you guys can see, black has gotten full control over the C file. And, my opponent, maybe, afraid of taking chances against a higher rated player, or, just not really seeing how to play on from here, just kind of took a draw. And, I think that this position is definitely harder to see than the, evaluate, especially from the previous position. But I feel like if we just break it down in terms of principles, what white is definitely on the worst side of things. And so if we don't even look at moves in this position, we just look at the overall dynamics of what's going on. My rook on g6 seems kind of strong. It's putting pressure on g7. It's technically pinning the f6 knight to the d6 pawn, and in some lines maybe I can get my rook on g1, move my king, and then play rook takes h6. So it looks like my rook to g6 optically is doing something, but in reality I think that this rook is not that great, because if you actually look at the number of squares it can go to right now, there's only one square it could go to that it doesn't get captured. That's rook to g3, and I already think like rook to g3 is an improvement over the rook on g6. Rooks are not good short range pieces. They're long range pieces. You want to think of them as like cannons. You don't want to fire a cannon 6 feet in front of your face. I would probably blow you up too. So that's that. If you look at my structure, I have space, but that doesn't necessarily mean I have a space advantage. So for example, even though I have pawns in the 5th rank, my h5 pawn can be taken whenever my opponent desires. So for example, okay, right now, if my opponent plays knight takes h5, I have this idea of rook to h1, and then rook on h1 takes h6 because of the pin. But my opponent can maybe try to trade off a pair of rooks, and this pawn on h5 is a permanent fixed weakness, meaning it can't move forward. It's never going to be protected by another pawn. It's a long-term issue, and if we were to make this position illegal for a second, and let's trade off a pair of rooks, let's trade off a pair of knights. Already in this endgame, and ignore the fact that the knight on c3 is hanging, with me for a second. Knight takes h5 is possible, and if white is using all of his resources to kind of to defend this pawn, well, he's already very tied down. This pawn on e4 is very weak, but if you look at this endgame, black, if he ever gets a take on h5, this endgame is immediately winning. So for example, if we just take this pawn off the board, and just for the sake of argument, let's just go ahead and keep things equal, because we just can't assume that black will win material. Let's say he has some tactical trade. This endgame is already much better for black, because black has control of the c file, which is something that I think will hold true for a large part of this endgame. And he has an outside pass pawn on h6. White has this annoying pawn on f5, but the pawn on g7 actually stops it from moving forward. And it's not so clear how white is going to handle, black's ability to push his pawn forward. He'll just play king f7, king f6, and the right moment come in with g5, king f4, put pressure on e4, and then start bringing this h-pawn down, bring the rook down on the c file. It's a pretty technical win at that point almost. It's just the idea of being able to use an edge pass pawn, weakness being controlling the h1 promotion square, protecting this e4 pawn, and these pawns just can't move fast enough with the pawn on a7. Black is totally fine. So already, in this position, if we think about it, if black can simplify, the position gets better for black, not worse. Okay, so the h5 pawn is a long-term weakness, and when it is lost, black will win the game. That's what we can conclude from that. Now, another thing to notice is, okay, well, we can't take on h5 right now, but we can also put pressure on the e4 pawn. If we put pressure on e4, well, if this pawn falls, well then f5 is already very weak. d5 is close to falling. This would definitely be interesting. So already, white has, to deal with this issue of this pawn on e4. And of course, the last thing is the knight on c3 is not only stuck protecting this pawn on e4, but it's pinned to the c2 square. And that's one thing that I don't hear talked about very often when people are talking about pins. Especially when I analyze games with like 14 to 1800 rated players is, they don't really take a minute and think about how a piece is pinned to a square. And it's, okay, it's not quite clear how like maybe c2 is, so important, but if you just stick to the idea that, okay, rooks on the 7th are just generally bad. Okay, well, allowing rook to c2, well, this would put pressure on e2, it would pin the knight to the king, the knight would need protecting, a2 is already very weak. So if we can get this knight to move, not only do we get a chance to attack on e4, but we also get a chance to infiltrate. So that being said, I am going to encourage you guys to pause the video, because we just looked at everything that black needs to know to come up with a concrete plan. So I would encourage you guys to pause your video. If you can't come up with concrete moves yet, that's fine. I just want you to think about this position in terms of, goals, what we just described. We want to use the c-file and the e4 and h5 weaknesses to our advantage. We also want to keep in mind that, even though black looks a little bit passive here, he actually has a lot of opportunity to get active. So try to come up with a plan here for black. Okay, well, if you haven't solved it yet, I would encourage you guys to continue pausing your videos and kind of trying to put the nuts and bolts together. But, we'd really like this knight on c3 to move. So I feel like the first candidate move is somewhat, obvious. It's this move b5. And this move I definitely did not see when I was at the board or in post-game analysis when I played this game. I want to say it was in 2013, or maybe even it was 2012. But this was not a position that I even considered. But looking at this position now, with all the deductions that we just made, I think it's rather obvious that this move has to be played for black to get some sort of an edge. And okay, so what's the idea? Well, we're threatening to play b4. If it's black's move this turn, let's just say like white, plays king to f2 or something. Okay, we'll just play b4 and we're taking this pawn on e4 with check next turn. So okay, well, white can't allow this. Okay, knight takes b5 is the critical move, but just to prove that there's really no other move to look at, a move like b4 runs into rook to c4. And already, black's going to play rook to c8, both b4 and e4 are threatened. This position falls apart rather quickly. And it's actually critical that this knight is on e8, as passive as it looks, because it holds the position together. If white can win this d6 pawn, white has a reasonable, shot at winning this game too. And, if white plays a move like a3, well, black can play a5, and again, we have this issue. Okay, well, white better do something. A3, I think, you could argue, but okay, let's say king to f3, so that way the pawn's protected. But now, in this position, it's clear that only one side is really pressing for an advantage, and that's the idea that black is the one pushing for an edge. If white pushes either one of the pawns, he creates a concession, right? So if like white plays a4 here, black has a pleasant choice. He can try to kick the knight and open up the c file, or he can take and then just use the b file to his advantage. Both I think are fair. If he plays b4, black can play a4 and then control some critical light squares, have a nice c4 square, or take and then try to control the a file. Personally, I think maybe a4 would be interesting because taking might allow for rook to a1 and it could get a little bit complicated. But here I think it's kind of straightforward that it's okay, black's going to put a rook on c4, put pressure on e4, double up the rooks, threaten to take too many pieces with the rook, and if the file is cleared, well, then rook to c2 comes in. And if not, once white moves his pieces over this way, knight takes h5, followed by knight to f4 might be possible, or even an interesting idea like knight h7, knight g5, trapping in the rook. So this would be maybe an interesting idea. So, okay, these positions all play very well. For black. And I think, okay, well, knight takes b5 is the line to look at, but we achieve our means. It's important, by the way, to not take on e4 just yet, because things get kind of complicated if this knight is forced to move because of the d6 pawn. So, let's avoid complications and counterplay. Let's just play this move rook to c2. a2 is hit, e2 is hit. White plays king to f3 to protect the pawn. But already this knight is a little bit awkward in terms of squares it can go to. Black already has some choices. He can play a6 to kick this knight. And if it goes back to c3, we can just play rook on so let's get this on the board. Rook on a to c8. And already we're threatening to get too many pieces for the rook and win this e4 pawn. So if white does nothing with this move a4, Okay, we'll take once, we'll take again, and this pawn can no longer be protected because knight takes e4 check is coming. If he goes to e2 or g3, if he goes to g2, well, we'll play knight takes g3, and these knights hold the d6 pawn in the structure. White has no way of attaining counterplay, and there's no like f6 ideas. So this is just lost. So white would have to move the knight again, and a2 would fall. So like, let's say he plays knight to a4. All right, well, a2 is falling now. There might even be some ideas of sacking the exchange and then taking on e4, but more realistically, we're just playing rook to c2 and controlling the file that way. White has no way of being able to ascertain any sort of counterplay in these sort of lines. So a6 would be an interesting option. I think also this might be appropriate. Obviously, if white plays a move like knight on e to c3, this knight is already lacking squares, and a6 is a legitimate threat after a move like rook to b2, where b3 is threatened, but also the integrity of the positioning of this knight is also under duress. So black has a lot of options, and I think this is also a very telling position because in both of these lines we're looking at specifically forced lines. In this case, I was like, okay, you play knight takes h5, you're in trouble, and if you don't do anything else, I'm just going to hold. But when one side has concrete problems, and in both of these games I was the side with concrete problems, then there's concrete solutions to try to take advantage of them, and they're not always going to win. And keep in mind, like in both of these games, I didn't exactly show you guys lines where one side was just winning tactically. It's a matter of outplaying your position, getting a little bit out of every move. And I think that first game really illustrated where we had that position where black had some choices between like g5 or bringing the king over to the queen side, or g5 and trying to bring the king over to the king side, or playing f5 and trying to undermine the integrity of the structure. I think that was kind of telling as to like how these positions play out. And these are more like practical endgames in the sense that they're more likely to happen on the board. You just have to assess what the advantages are for each side. And I think that in this position, visually, okay, maybe it looks like white's doing really well because white has space, but space isn't an advantage. And I thought that this was kind of an interesting example. So I highly encourage you guys to, when you're calculating these endgames, to think about these steps as you go along, and think about how you can break down the position into different advantages and disadvantages, and try to find ways to kind of break through. There were a lot of cases in these lines. Like I'll stress it again. Like I didn't look at a computer or anything for any concrete analysis. I only wanted to confirm this b5 move. I didn't even look at the computer for the other line. But I think, as you guys can see, like it doesn't take perfect play to get a good position, especially when you already have a positional advantage. So this mentality of playing in this kind of an endgame isn't that different than playing in a middle game. There's just fewer pieces, so structural advantages are extremely important if they can translate into a simplified endgame that's just completely worse. So I hope you enjoyed this lecture. This is Canada Master Isaac Steincamp signing off from the Chess Summit Network.